sister called me at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was already awake sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, going over my budget spreadsheet for the month. That's the kind of person I am. The kind who wakes up before her alarm and checks her numbers before the sun is fully up. My sister, on the other hand, is the kind of person who only calls before 8 a.m. when something has gone very wrong. "Nora," she said, before I could even say hello, "I need you to come to Mom and Dad's this weekend. It's important." Her voice had that particular flatness to it. Not crying, not angry, just tamped down in a way that meant she was trying very hard to hold something together. I asked her what happened. She said she'd explain when I got there. I asked again. She said it was better in person. I drove 4 hours that Saturday. I should give you some background because the Saturday I'm talking about didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing in my family ever does. There's always been a long, slow current running underneath everything. And if you've grown up in a house like mine, you learn pretty early to read the water. I'm the younger of 2 daughters. My sister, who I'll call by the name I've always called her, she's 6 years older than me, and she married young right out of college to a man I will simply refer to as her husband because that's the most charitable thing I can call him, and I'm trying to be fair here. They have 2 kids. They live about 40 minutes from my parents, in a house they bought at the peak of the market with a mortgage that was, from the beginning, more house than they could afford. I did not buy too much house. I did not buy any house for a long time, because I was careful. I went to school on a merit scholarship, full ride to a state university, not because my family had connections, but because I studied while everyone else was at parties, and I tested well and I wrote an application essay that my English teacher said made her tear up. I graduated with a degree in accounting and no student debt. I got a job at a mid-size firm in Charlotte, moved into a one-bedroom apartment, and I lived like I was still a broke college student for 5 years after I was no longer a broke college student. I'm telling you this because it matters, not because I want credit for it. I'm not looking for a trophy, but because what happened later only makes sense if you understand that the money I had saved did not fall out of the sky. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard for 3 years after I could have replaced it. I brought lunch to work every single day. I cooked at home. I had one streaming subscription and I split it with my college roommate. I did all of that over years, and by the time I was 32 years old, I had a little over $90,000 sitting in accounts that I had built from nothing. Nobody in my family knew the exact number. Or so I thought. My mother met me at the door when I pulled into the driveway that Saturday. She hugged me in the way she hugs me when she wants something. A little too long, a little too tight, with a hand rubbing slow circles on my back like I was still 7 years old and homesick from school. My father was in the living room. My sister was sitting at the kitchen table. Her husband was not there, which I noticed immediately. We sat down. My mother made coffee. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute, which is a very long time to sit in silence with your family when you know something bad is coming. My father was the one who started talking. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had only been 2 months before at Easter, and something about that scared me before he even said a word. He folded his hands on the table and he told me that my sister's husband had made some bad investments over the past 18 months. He used that word, investments, in a tone that made it clear he had chosen it carefully. I found out later that what he meant was that my brother-in-law had taken out 3 separate personal loans to fund what he believed was a fail-safe real estate scheme run by a guy he met at his gym, a guy who turned out to have no real estate license, no registered business, and was currently, as of 6 weeks before this conversation, the subject of a fraud investigation in 2 states. My brother-in-law had lost $140,000. I sat with that number for a moment. $140,000. Most of which was borrowed. Which meant the debt collectors had already started calling. Which meant they were about 3 months from missing their first mortgage payment. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "We need you to help," she said. I looked at her. I looked at my father. I looked at my sister, who was staring at her coffee cup. "Help how?" I said. My father cleared his throat. He said they had already taken out a home equity line on their own house, their retirement, their security, the house they'd lived in for 27 years, and that between that and what they had in savings, they could cover about 60,000. But there was still a gap, and they didn't want my sister's family to lose their home. The kids were 8 and 11. It would devastate them. "We know you've been saving," my mother said. And there it was. I want to stop here for a second, because I need to tell you something. Before I go any further with this story, I want to ask you something honestly. If you had worked for a decade, quietly and without fanfare, to build a safety net for yourself, would you hand it over to cover someone else's gambling losses? Because that's what this was. I'm sorry to be blunt, but a guy who took out loans to give money to a fraud is a gambler who lost. The only difference between what my brother-in-law did and sitting down at a poker table and losing your mortgage is that at least poker is legal. I said I needed to think about it. My mother said there wasn't much time to think. My sister finally looked up from her coffee cup. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were red and I could see she'd been crying for probably most of that morning. And I felt the full, awful weight of loving someone and being angry at them at the exact same time. I drove home that night instead of staying the weekend like I planned. I needed to be in my own space. I needed to think without my mother's hand on mine. The following week was one of the harder weeks I've had. I talked to my two closest friends. One of them is an attorney. One of them has been my best friend since we were freshmen in college. And I told them the whole situation. My attorney friend was the one who said, very gently, that I needed to understand that giving money to someone in active financial crisis often doesn't solve the crisis, it just delays it, and that if my brother-in-law hadn't addressed the actual problem, his judgment, his impulse control, whatever had led him to hand money to a stranger at a gym, then giving him $90,000 was pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. She also said something else. She said, "You need to make sure your own finances are locked down. Change your passwords. Check who has access to what. Do it now, before this gets messier." I thought that was a little dramatic at the time. I called my sister the following Thursday. I told her I loved her. I told her I was heartbroken about what she was going through and that I wished things were different. And I told her I couldn't give them the money. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom's not going to take this well." She was right. My mother called me the next morning. I have a complicated relationship with my mother, which is probably true for a lot of women my age, and I don't want to be unfair to her here, because I know she was scared and stressed and she loves my sister's kids in a way that makes her willing to do almost anything. But the call was hard. She told me I was being selfish. She said that family takes care of family, that this is what you do, that my sister needed me, and I was turning my back on her. She said she didn't raise me to put money above people. I tried to stay calm. I said that I understood she was scared. I said that I had worked very hard for the money I had, and that I was not willing to put my own financial future at risk for a situation I had nothing to do with creating. I said that I was happy to help them find resources, a financial counselor, a bankruptcy attorney, a HUD-approved housing counselor, because those things existed and could actually help. My mother said I'd clearly become very cold. I said I was sorry she felt that way. She said she needed to know if I was going to help or not, because they needed to make decisions. I said I was not going to contribute my savings to cover the debt. She hung up. For the next 2 weeks, I got calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I picked up the first two before I realized what was happening. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 4 years told me that she hoped I would pray on this and consider what was right. A cousin who I don't even know well told me I was the type of person who would regret this when it mattered. I started letting everything go to voicemail. The messages piled up. One evening I came home from work and found a voicemail from my father. He almost never calls me. He leaves the phone calls to my mother. And hearing his voice surprised me enough that I sat down on the couch with my coat still on to listen. He said he was proud of me and that he knew I worked hard. He said he wasn't calling to pressure me. He said he just missed me and hoped I was okay. That one was the hardest to listen to. I called him back. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular: a nature documentary he'd been watching, a book I was reading, the weather in both our cities. We didn't mention money once. When we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and I let myself cry for a little while, which I think I needed. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. 11 words: "If you won't help your family, you're not welcome here." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the coffee table and I sat there for a long time. The next morning, I did several things. I called my bank and reviewed every account I had: the savings, the Roth IRA, the brokerage account I'd opened 2 years earlier. I confirmed that no one else had access to any of them. I updated my passwords on everything. I removed my mother as the emergency contact on my health insurance and updated it to my best friend. I called my HR department and quietly verified that my direct deposit and benefits were all locked to my personal logins only. I also called a financial advisor, someone I'd been meaning to consult for a while, and I made an appointment. Not because of the family situation, but because the family situation had reminded me that I needed to be more deliberate about protecting what I'd built. We talked about setting up a proper emergency fund structure, about estate planning basics, about what protections I had. It was one of the more useful 2 hours I'd spent in recent memory. That afternoon, I drafted a letter. Not angry. I don't do angry well in writing. It always comes out wrong. But clear. I wrote to my mother and copied my father. I told them that I understood they were in pain and that I was sorry our family was going through this. I told them that my decision was final and that I was not going to change it. I told them that I was still their daughter and I still loved them, but that I was not going to accept the framing that refusing to give away my life savings made me unwelcome in my own family. I told them I hoped they would get the help they needed, and that when they were ready to have a real conversation, I was there. I sent it. And then I went for a walk. Because I needed air. I didn't hear back for 11 days. During those 11 days, the calls and messages continued from extended family. I stopped counting after about 25. A few of them were kind in a misguided way, people who clearly just wanted to help and thought they were mediating something they didn't fully understand. Most of them were not kind. One of my aunts, who I genuinely used to love spending holidays with, left me a voicemail so full of venom that I had to listen to it twice to make sure I'd heard it right. She said that I had always thought I was better than everyone else, that my education had made me arrogant, that my sister's children would grow up knowing that their aunt had chosen her bank account over them. I thought about what I wanted to say back to her for about 3 days. I wrote a few drafts in my journal. In the end, I sent nothing. Not because I was taking the high road in some triumphant way. I just genuinely didn't think anything I said would change anything, and I didn't have the energy for a fight that would only make me feel worse. My sister texted me about 2 weeks after my mother sent her ultimatum. She said she was sorry for how things had gotten. She said she didn't blame me. She said her husband was going to talk to a bankruptcy attorney, and they were also starting marriage counseling, which was something I hadn't expected to hear. I texted her back that I was really glad. We talked on the phone for a while after that. It was stilted and careful, but it was a real conversation. And it was the first time in over a month that I felt like I still had a sister. She told me something during that call that I hadn't known. She said that my mother had found out how much money I had because my brother-in-law had mentioned at a dinner I wasn't at that he'd heard I had a lot in savings. He'd apparently overheard me and my sister talking about my Roth IRA contributions at a previous family gathering years earlier, when I'd been trying to convince her to start one. My sister had said something offhand about how I was always saving and never spent anything, and my brother-in-law, who was apparently already by then thinking about where money could come from, had filed that away. And then when everything collapsed, he'd repeated it to my parents. I had been careless in a moment of enthusiasm, trying to share something I'd learned with someone I loved, and it had become ammunition. I thought about that for a long time. Here is what I want to say because I think this is the part that matters. I do not regret my decision. I want to be honest about that without being smug about it, because I know how it sounds when someone says I was right about something that hurt people they love. But I was right. Not in a cold way, in a true way. The money I saved was earned slowly and carefully, and it was mine. And no amount of family pressure changes what's fair. A gambling loss is a gambling loss whether or not anyone wants to call it that. Enabling it is not love, it's just delaying the same crash for a few more months. What I do feel, and what I think is worth saying, is that this whole experience taught me something I should have already known. Financial privacy is not paranoia. It is a form of self-protection. I am not saying you should hide things from people you trust. I am saying that trust and financial exposure are not the same thing, and you should be thoughtful about who knows what. The other thing I will say is this. My sister is still my sister. We're not where we were, but we're working on it. Her family did talk to a bankruptcy attorney and they restructured the debt. They're still in their house. My brother-in-law is in therapy, which I honestly did not think would happen. My mother has not explicitly apologized, but she called me on my birthday 2 months later and talked to me for an hour like nothing had happened, which in my family is basically an apology. My father texts me links to nature documentaries, sometimes. We are all slowly finding our way back to something. I still have my savings. I opened a high-yield account and moved a portion of it there. I met with my financial advisor again and we set up a clear plan for the next 5 years. I started volunteering 2 Saturdays a month at a nonprofit that teaches financial literacy to teenagers in underserved communities, something I'd been wanting to do for a while but kept putting off. The first time I walked a group of 16-year-olds through the basics of compound interest and why starting a Roth IRA at their age would be one of the most powerful things they could ever do. I thought about the version of myself who'd had to figure all of this out alone, without anyone ever teaching me, and I felt something I don't have a clean word for. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than that. I'm 32 years old. I have a good job and a clear head and enough in savings to handle an emergency without panicking. Nobody gave that to me. And no one, not my mother's guilt, not my aunt's voicemail, not 25 phone calls from people who had no idea what they were talking about, was going to take it from me. That's the whole story. It doesn't have a tidy bow on it because real things don't. But I'm okay. More than okay. And I still drive the Honda. I keep coming back to that moment at the kitchen table, my mother's hand over mine. The coffee going cold. My sister staring at her cup like it might tell her something useful. There was so much love in that room and so much fear, and the two things have gotten so tangled together that nobody could separate them anymore. I understand that now better than I did then. What I've learned, sitting with all of it over these past months, is that the choices that define you are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. The years of brown bag lunches and skipped vacations and saying, "not yet" to yourself when you wanted to say yes. Those choices built something, and when the moment came to either protect that thing or surrender it to a crisis I had no hand in creating, the decision wasn't actually hard. It only felt hard because of who was asking. There's a version of integrity that looks like stubbornness from the outside. I know that's how my aunt saw it. I know that's how my mother felt in those first weeks, but doing the right thing for yourself is not the same as doing the wrong thing by your family. Those two ideas got conflated in that kitchen, and I refused to let them stay conflated. My brother-in-law made a choice, a series of choices actually, over 18 months, that put his family in danger. The consequences of those choices were not mine to absorb. Recognizing that is not coldness, it's clarity. What I wish someone had told me earlier, and what I now try to pass on when I'm sitting with those teenagers on Saturday mornings, walking them through compound interest and savings rates, is that financial self-sufficiency is one of the most ethical things you can build. It means you never have to beg. It means you can help people from a place of strength when you genuinely choose to, not from a place of guilt when you're being maneuvered into it. The girl who studied while everyone else was at parties, who drove the cracked dashboard Civic, who said no to herself 1,000 small times, she was building something that nobody could take. That's not selfishness. That's the foundation that makes everything else possible. And the intelligence part. Because I do think there's something to be said for thinking clearly under pressure. That came from listening to my friend when she told me to lock down my accounts before things got messier. She was right. Knowledge protects you. Understanding how your own finances work, who has access to what and why, what your actual rights are, that's not paranoia, it's literacy. I had been careless once, letting the wrong information reach the wrong person, and I paid for it in a different way than money, but paid for it nonetheless. The grit part, the part where you sit with 25 missed calls and a text that says you're not welcome anymore and you don't cave, that one I had to find on my own. Nobody teaches you how to hold a boundary when the people pushing against it are the ones you've loved your whole life. You just have to decide what you can live with. I could not have lived with myself if I'd handed over everything I built out of fear of losing people who, it turned out, were still there when the dust settled. My sister and I talked last week. My father sent me a link to a documentary about deep-sea fish. My savings are intact. And I'm still driving the Honda, though I did finally replace the cracked dashboard. Some things you hold on to. Some things you hold on to. Some things you let go. Knowing the difference is the whole project.